Suburban roads tend to be wide and as straight as possible so that we can drive fast. Apopka Vineland, right out here next to the church, what is the speed limit out there? 45. How many people actually go 45? One. And this is a road that drives past lots of neighborhoods, and the intersection right out here is a fairly straightforward intersection, right? It's square, it's all lined up, you can see the stoplights, but there are more accidents at that intersection than you would imagine. Linda hears them all the time. And I think it's simply because of the speed. Now, last week I was in St. Paul, and just north of where my aunt and uncle live, there are two roads that are both two-way roads that merge into one road. And I would try to explain what that intersection looks like. It doesn't have any stoplights, stop signs, and all sorts of signs, but it would just be confusing. It's enough to know that when you come up to it, you slow down and pay a lot of attention because it doesn't make sense right when you see it. And even my aunt, who's lived there for a number of years, as she was driving up to it, said, "Oh, I hate this intersection," because you have to pay closer attention. I read an article years ago that said when roads are long and straight and you can go fast, we disengage a little bit in our attention because, the car just keeps going. But when you come to something that's unusual, where the angles are all weird or the lights are in weird places, you do slow down and pay different attention. And then there ends up being less accidents because you're more focused. And this is sort of how I think parables function. They are stories that come at us at an angle and in a different way than we might expect, and so they cause us to slow down. The story we just heard, this parable that Jesus tells, this rich man has a manager that has squandered his property and then gone out and out of his own selfish desire to not work too hard, starts to give debt forgiveness to some of the debtors that owe this rich man money. And if this was a wide, fast, straight road story that does what we expect, what would we expect to happen to that manager? He'd get in trouble, right? The rich man might go to the authorities. He might even go back to those debtors and say, "That was unauthorized. You owe me all the money I owe you." But that's not what happens. What happens in the story is the rich man commends the manager for what he has done. And we don't really see that coming. And so as a parable that comes at us at a little bit of an angle, we have to slow down and say, okay, let's pay a little bit more attention to what's happening here. Now, I've always tried to figure out why would the rich man say that? What were his motives? Like maybe the debtors would look and say, "Oh, what a generous rich man this guy is. He just cut some of our debt," and not maybe give credit to the manager who actually was the one that did it. But then if you pay attention, as Jesus keeps talking, he doesn't talk about the rich man. He talks about the manager. And Jesus then provides commentary on the story. He says, if you can't be faithful with a little, who's going to give you a lot? If you can't be faithful with the dishonest wealth, who's going to give you true riches? If you read in a Bible that's got little headings, it will call this the parable of the dishonest manager. And we understand that because look, the manager did things he wasn't supposed to with somebody else's money. Does the story call the manager dishonest? What does it call dishonest? If you can't be faithful with the dishonest wealth, who's going to give you the true riches? So if we slow down at this intersection of this parable and listen to how Jesus unpacks it, right? He tells the story, and then he says, if you can't be faithful with the little, if you can't be faithful with the dishonest wealth, who's going to give you the true riches? Jesus does not attach dishonest to the manager. He attaches it to the wealth. So then you have to go back and think about the story again. If the rich man is rich and his wealth is dishonest, he's got people that owe him money, perhaps he cheated them. Perhaps he uses this wealth that he has gotten dishonestly to manipulate them and draw them into debt cycles that they can't get out of. And in that case, when this manager comes and forgives some, not all of their debt, the manager is perhaps bringing some level of justice to a place where there has been injustice. If the wealth was dishonest and you forgive some of it, are you cheating the rich person? Or are you bringing some right into a place where there was wrong? And I really do think this story is about literal debt. Sometimes we take the gospel and make it into a metaphor, right? So we would say, well, let's see, this is debt and forgiveness, so it must be about sin and trespasses and how we interact as people. And sometimes we should do that because the gospel is not all literal, right? When we take the Lord's Prayer, Jesus says in Matthew, forgive us our debts, but we in the prayer will say, forgive us our sins, forgive us our trespasses, right? But in this case, if we go to the very last verse of this passage, Jesus says, you cannot serve God and wealth. So he just told a story about debt, and then at the end says you cannot serve God and wealth. So I wonder if Jesus really isn't talking literally about debt and the way that debt weighs on us, and what he calls faithful in the story, right? He says, if you cannot be faithful with dishonest wealth, and the manager gets praised for relieving debt. So what the story seems to do is say that forgiving someone of debt, easing some of the burden of financial debt that they carry, and all of the stress and everything that goes with that, that seems to be what Jesus says is faithful. So when we come at this story and are trying to understand all these things, if we slow down and just pay attention to what Jesus says, somebody forgave somebody's debt, they were praised for it, and then Jesus says, if you can't be faithful with that dishonest wealth, faithful meaning probably that he forgave some debt, then who's going to give you the true riches? So standing at this intersection now where we have slowed down, we can ask, what does this parable teach us about the world around us? What does it teach us about faithfulness, and what does it teach us about God? So if we take it and say, well, the story is about debt and wealth. Do we have debt around us? Is it problematic? I did a fair bit of reading about debt this week. Gen Xers, my generation, has the most debt of any generation. And you could probably say, well, we just aren't willing to go without the things that we want. But we're also at that stage in life where we're starting to care for our own parents, but also trying to put our kids through college, right? And that can bring some financial pressure. Millennials are the next with the most debt. We have a friend that used to work works at a bank and said that the greatest generation paid cash for their house. They were very much shaped by the Depression. You baby boomers financed your house expecting to pay it off, and some of you probably have. We financed our houses not ever expecting to pay off a mortgage, which is true. I don't ever think we'll pay off a mortgage. And millennials are like, gosh, these student loans, how am I going to afford a house? I know a couple of millennial pastors, a clergy couple, who have paid off some of their student loans already from undergrad and seminary, but still have $121,000 in student loans. And when you layer on top of that medical bills that are way higher than you thought they were going to be, and you get stuck with them and the other kind of financial stuff that comes at us, debt can be a problem. And then when the economy went down like a decade ago, some of you probably went upside down in your houses, and that debt became much more of a burden than it was before. Now those are all debts that are carried by people who can qualify for a mortgage, qualify for a credit card, qualify for student loans. There's a whole different kind of debt that poor people get pulled into. There are communities that just don't have a bank. And if you don't have a bank and you don't have a savings account, where do you get your check cashed? You go to a check cashing place. And the interest rates that they charge are enormous. And so then you get caught into this cycle where you can barely pay off the last one, if you can pay it off at all, and you continue to then just get caught in this debt circle. So there's that kind of debt that poor people carry. But there's also increasingly, if you look across our nation, and this is true in Florida, we more and more do not fund our courts by taxes, right? You would think, well, the court is a function of our shared life together. Our taxes should pay judges and all the rest of that. We more and more fund our courts on the fees and the fines that the people that end up in court pay. So how many of you have had a ticket? I've had one, like you can be honest, right? So I got a red light ticket. I was behind a really tall truck. I was halfway through the intersection before I saw that the light was red, and then I got a ticket in the mail. So what did I do? Paid it. So imagine that you're poor, really poor, and your address changes relatively frequently. Or you live in a hotel because you don't have a house. Where do they send your red light ticket? So you don't get your red light ticket. What happens when the judge wonders where you are when you didn't show up for court? right? Your fines go up, your license gets suspended. Now you can't go to work because your license just got suspended. Or you can go to work, but then if you get caught, then you might lose your license. And the fines and the fees just pile up, but you can't pay them because you don't have any money in the first place. So there comes more debt. So if we listen to this story and say, do we have debt problems around us? We can certainly say yes. What else can this story teach us about the world around us? I would say that I think we have an unquestioned premise in our culture that wealth is good. We just generally, I would say as a culture, believe that is the case. We talk about work hard, pull yourselves up, it's yours if you earned it, do what you will. When you start talking about taxes, people say that's mine, leave it alone. When you talk about the lottery, I bet most of you have a threshold that if it gets high enough, you're like, well, okay, I'll get a lottery ticket. Right? Because we just generally assume that if we had more wealth, things would be better. And this story, Jesus calls the wealth dishonest. And if you look around our culture and our capitalism, do we ever see dishonest wealth? Mm-hmm. All the time. You can just go down and the dishonest wealth doesn't always come to you, right? It goes to the shareholders, right? So when Volkswagen programmed their cars to cheat emission standards, did any of you get that money? No, right? So there's dishonest wealth. So at a minimum, I think this story can cause us to stop and say, maybe we shouldn't just assume wealth is a good thing. And we don't need to dig in deep to that today because that could be a whole nother sermon. But I think this story should cause us to at least ask that question. But the third thing, and I think this is the most important thing this story can cause us to wrestle with, is fairness. When the manager goes around, the first person he encounters, he cuts their bill by half. The second one only gets 20%. Now, Jesus doesn't get into it, but can you imagine those two having a conversation? Well, why did you only get 20%? Like, I got half. Well, of course I did. I work harder than you do, right? Like, you could see where this stuff starts to come out. And if you think about in our culture, the ways that we talk about this, fairness always comes into it. We have some presidential candidates that have suggested student loan forgiveness. And there's all kinds of questions that go with that. How do you pay for it and everything else? But the one thing I hear a lot is people saying, well, nobody forgave my student loans. Why should they get their student loans forgiven? Or, I worked my way through school. I didn't even take out loans. I worked a full-time job, and I was a school, and I was a mom, or whatever those things are. And then we say it's not fair then to give someone else forgiveness for something that the rest of us worked for. And that's just one example, but if you look around our culture, how often do we talk about fairness, often through our own lens of our own perceived hard work or whatever it is that we have done? Now, in the story, there's those different levels. That doesn't even get addressed. So if we take all of these things gathered up, this story, I think, can cause us to stop and think about debt, about wealth, and about how we think God works in the world and what fairness looks like, especially when it comes to God's grace. Now, again, we could spiritualize this, but if it literally is sort of about debt and wealth and everything, I think what this story might be telling us is that grace sometimes can look like your literal financial debt got forgiven. So then we could say, well, what does this call us to be as the church? Now, there's lots of things Jesus tells us to go do, but maybe what Jesus is telling us to do in this story is to free people from financial debt. To do what we can, to do what the manager did, which is to work in the dishonest system that he's in and provide some level of freedom from debt. And if we can do that, right, to work within the systems of our world that are broken and do what we can to free people from debt, maybe that is a gift of grace that we can give to people. So we do this, by the way. People stop by here asking for help. And when they come in here asking for help, it's always because they have a debt. Now, it may not be a credit card debt. A woman that comes to mind, she's been here twice in my 4.5 years here. The first time she had a massive heart attack, was in the hospital for a good number of weeks, so she couldn't go to work and she lost her job. Her daughter had to care for her, so she lost her job, and by the time she came to visit here, she had been everywhere she could imagine. She was a month and a half behind on rent and behind on electric. So she had a debt. Could we pay the whole thing off? We couldn't, but we paid and got her caught up a month. Is it a gift of grace to get somebody caught up so they don't get evicted tomorrow?
Yes.
Yes. And most of the time when people come here, it's because they're getting evicted tomorrow. right? They're desperate and they're trying to find some space. The next time she came back, had another massive surgery and another lost job, and the daughter had to stop working and take care of her, and she was behind on her rent, behind on her electric, and we were able to catch her up just enough so she didn't get evicted tomorrow. That is a gift of grace. Have any of you ever had a debt forgiven? Couple of hands. How did that feel? Great. So I had super blessed. I got through most of seminary without having to take out like large student loans, which is a huge thing in our seminaries and pastor stuff right now. I had one $2,500 student loan that was interest-free, and when I was about 2/3 of the way paying it off, I got a letter in the mail that said a church that I preached at my senior year paid it off. I did not ask them to do that. They paid me to preach there, so they didn't owe me anything. They just one day looked and said, you know what, we've got enough money. Let's pay off all the student loans of the students that have been here preaching and sharing time with us. And I'll tell you, that felt amazing. And it was at a time in our financial life where not having to pay that $75 a month, we now could do something else with that money that they gifted us, sort of this freedom. So I think part of what this story is trying to tell us is that God's grace isn't just about forgiveness and salvation, which it is, and all the work that Jesus does, but that it also can be very practical in the ways that we live in the world and the gifts that we have been given to literally free people from debt. And there are people that do this. There's a church, I think around here, that is gathered together and pooling their resources and paying off people's medical debt. And there's been stories at Christmas sometimes of people who go into like Walmart and pay off people's layaway so they can have Christmas gifts for their kids. And every time that happens, somebody probably sits up and goes, wow, somebody just freed me from this debt that I had. And that's amazing. So the story can teach us a little bit about the world around us. It can teach us that maybe grace sometimes can be very practical about debt. But what does it teach us about God? And I think it can teach us a couple of things about God. One is that God works with what we give God. So if Jesus had come into the world and said, follow me, and everybody said, you know what, that makes a lot of sense what you're saying. We're going to stop fighting, and we're going to lay down our weapons, and we're going to follow you and be wonderful, gracious, loving human beings to one another, and it solved all the world's problems, would Jesus have ended up on the cross? No, God would have said, oh good, they're following him. That's what I have to work with. But that's not what happened. Instead, Jesus came into the world and we gave God a cross and a death on the cross. And God said, well, I can work with that. I can work with that. We'll go with resurrection then and bring Jesus back to life and give all of you new life. So if God works with what we give God, and what we give God are dishonest financial systems and dishonest wealth and debt and brokenness, then God says, okay, we can work with that. And how does God work with that? Grace, but that grace is worked through us, right? And in those places where people forgive debts, like when they forgave my debt by paying that off for me, God can work with that. And it was amazing. But the other thing then I think we can see in this story is Jesus' whole journey really as he gets toward the cross. How does Judas get to the point of betraying him?
Money.
Money, right? Is that honest wealth? Mm-mm. It sure isn't. And then as Jesus gets to the cross, was that an honest business that was going on? Not at all. So Jesus' whole journey to the cross is just wrapped up in dishonest wealth and betrayal and all the rest of that. And somehow God comes out the other side of that with life. And so as we take all of this together, right, you've got debt and you've got wealth and you've got our need for stuff to be fair. Was that fair when Jesus got hung on the cross? Not at all. Right? But God still brought life out of that. Then you come down to the end of this, and I want to come back to that intersection, right? So parables slow us down and cause us to think more deeply about the story that they're telling us. What if we are God's parables? What if when we go out into the world and live the way Jesus invites us to do, just like when I got that debt forgiven, that slowed me down for a minute. Did that do the same for you? Yeah, right? It happens and you just kind of go, oh, who does that? And then you start to ask questions and think differently. So if we are God's parables, if we go out into the world and forgive people's debts in this case, or do any of the rest of the stuff that Jesus invites us to do, when people encounter us, they go, whoa, what is that? Why is this person doing that? What are their motives, right? They got all kinds of questions. But ultimately, when it's a gift of grace, they just go, huh. And they maybe just have to say thank you eventually, right? When they can't figure out anything else as to why this is happening. But in that way, God's love works through us and touches other people's lives and enlivens our faith as we go along, because as we do what Jesus calls us to do, it inspires us as it inspires the peoples around us. So as we go out from this day, my hope is that we can take this story and literally see that maybe there's a call for us to go and forgive debts in any way that we can. But also to know that as we do that, we are parables that slow the world down around us a little bit and bring God's grace alive so that people can see it at work, and in seeing it at work, find new life in themselves as well. Amen.
Amen.